Hello, and welcome to Inequality Talks, a podcast from the volunteers at Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, Aarhus. This episode will be a part of the Inequality Interviews series, where we invite guest speakers to come and share their knowledge and expertise. I'm Edward, and with me today is Lars Koch, the Policy Director of Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke. Today's topic is tax havens and tax evasion, which is an area that Lars knows particularly well through his work at Oxfam and Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke the last 15 years. We're very glad that you could join us here today, Lars. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
You are here in the capacity of being an expert on tax havens. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about your background before we get started. Like how did you come to be involved in this topic, and why does it interest you?
Well, I have a background as political scientist, but always been occupied with what I call structural causes of poverty at the global level. And I came into tax justice when I lived in Bolivia back in 2001 to 4, where I worked with indigenous people and on extractive industries, mining, oil, gas. And we looked at all the negative social, environmental consequences of these extractive industries. However, I also wondered what happened to all the profits from these resources. They tended to escape the countries, and you didn't see any development where you exploited the resources. And that led me into considering tax dodging, tax evasion, and how can we make sure that developing countries better profit from the resources and activities taking place in their countries. So that's what led me into tax tax justice.
Okay, interesting. We'll touch in on the international aspect of it later, but maybe we could start with some basics. You know, what are tax havens and how do they work for listeners who maybe don't know that much about this phenomenon?
That's a good question because there's no clear definition of what is a tax haven. And many people perceive tax havens as small Caribbean islands, and that is far from the whole truth. Tax havens are jurisdictions, and that does also mean not necessarily countries, but jurisdictions which are attached to, for example, the United Kingdom. Where you have elements of secrecy, that is, mean you can hide your money, you can hide who's the beneficial owner of companies. You cannot see who actually owns the companies. They don't have to present their accounts and their balances. So secrecy is one key element at any tax haven. Another key element is a zero or low tax rate. That means that you enable companies to base themselves there and avoid paying any taxes. And the third element is often that you have specific rules for international companies, which are different from local companies in a larger tax havens. I mean, this applies to many countries. Also, Denmark have features, and I think it's better to talk about features of tax havens, where there's an element in Denmark where you also can hide some of your ownership information. So that's a feature of a tax haven. It's not very strong in Denmark. It's much stronger in Switzerland. It's much stronger in the United States or in the city of London or in small Caribbean islands. But it's important to understand that tax havens is features of tax systems across 200 plus jurisdictions, and what enables tax avoidance, which is almost in any cases legal, is that you can exploit the loopholes between these 200 different tax systems, and these loopholes are established by tax havens and by the tax havens or the tax advisory industry. That is the big accountancy companies and the tax lawyers who advise also countries how they can adapt their legislation to attract tax base from other countries. I call it steal tax bases from other countries. You enable companies to move their profits to your country, where you only take a tiny little profit or some fees for establishing yourself in the country, and by that stealing the tax base and enabling wealthy people or corporates to avoid paying taxes.
Okay, so it's not one place or one thing. It's
a system. It's a system.
Okay, interesting. In my mind, it seems like it's maybe more difficult to do anything about it if it's not just one place and a few people. It's a network of.
I mean, it's important to understand that tax havens are. They are there for a reason. Those who benefit from tax havens are wealthy people, wealthy individuals who want to hide their profits either from their wife or because they have looted governments from corruption, or because they just have a huge wealth that they want to leave untaxed. It's criminals, corrupt gangsters, mafias, terrorists. It's black money, which they launder through tax havens to take into the white or the legal economy and spending on housing and luxury yachts and private jets and whatever they spend it on. And it's for corporates who want to avoid taxes. So these are the most powerful players on the planet. It's the largest corporations, it's the most wealthy individuals, and it's institutions like the accountancy companies and the tax lawyers. And they have such a vested interest in maintaining this system because it's extremely profitable to them. And therefore, getting this right is also, addressing the economic power of the planet, and that's what makes it complicated.
Okay, so no less of a task than addressing the entire planet,
or the economic power holders of the planet.
Yeah. You mentioned something about legality there, and I'm getting the impression that maybe tax havens aren't necessarily illegal. Does it make sense to talk about legality?
It does. And when I talk to, and I do that very often, when I talk to the big multinational companies, or also to wealthy individuals and their representatives, they say, "But this is legal. What's the problem?" And the problem is exactly that a system which allows the wealthiest people and the largest corporation on the planet to avoid paying the same taxes that small and medium-sized enterprises or ordinary workers like you and I, that we pay in tax. This system that legalizes this the structure, that's the problem, that it's legal. And the reason for why most of this, what happens, is legal, is that you have these 200 global tax jurisdictions where you can exploit the different loopholes, and many of these loopholes are established to be exploited. When Cayman Island holds secrecy about who are the beneficial owners of the capital funds on Cayman, that's for a reason. So it's in most cases it's legal, and exactly what the tax lawyers and the accountant companies does is to help individuals and corporates to make a legal tax avoidance. However, some of that is in the gray or in the black area. One element is that you have dirty money, from corruption, terrorists, or just ordinary fraud, which is money laundered through tax havens. That's the money themselves are illegal, and they use this system to clean them in order to use them in the wide economy. But in some cases also, it's a gray area, and you don't know what is legal and what is not legal until it has been tested in the courtroom, and that is extremely costly and difficult. So in many cases, a tax advisor will say, we set up this structure where you establish a mother company in Cayman Island, you have a subsidiary in Luxembourg, and then you hold your profits in Denmark, and you move around the money. Let's see, it's potentially it's legal. Potentially, if it's detected by the authorities, they'll call it out. But they'll advise you on what's your risk profile, how many risks do you want to take for being detected and potentially finding this illegal. But it's a kind of a system where you always go to the limits of what's possible.
Is there maybe any clue in, because you hear some different terms like tax evasion and tax avoidance and also tax fraud. Is there maybe any clue as to sort of legality in those terms, or are they interchangeable?
No, they're definitely not. I mean, tax avoidance is the legal way where you exploit the system. You do what you call profit shifting as a multinational company, which in most cases is legal. Some cases it's in this gray area, in some cases it could be illegal. And if it becomes illegal, it becomes tax evasion, which is illegal, or fraud. So it's very important to, on the one hand, distinct between this, and I mostly talk about tax avoidance, the legal thing, because that's the main problem. When it's just illegal, then it's just about, getting into the courtroom. But the problem is that most of what is happening is actually somehow legal or potentially legal.
Okay, that's interesting, because that hints, as you say, that maybe the system has to change and not just, going after the odd criminal.
Yeah. And this is crucial because our counterparts in this discussion on tax justice, they say this it's legal as long as it's legal. But the problem is that the legality is established by smaller and larger countries who deliberately put in place legislation which allows a system which is extremely unjust.
It's interesting you're mentioning unjust there, because I'm also curious. If it is legal, then at least at some point, I think most of us will still say that it's a problem. And I was wondering if maybe you know anything about whether or not people who, let's call them tax evaders, if there's some sort of identifiable moral or ethic defense, or do they just prefer to hide their money and then you never know who they are? And
if there are two elements of tax avoidance, the multinationals and the wealthy individuals. And when you look at the wealthy individuals, there's a tendency, and there's a famous sociologist who did some inside analysis of the tax havens industry and the people, the advisors and the wealthy individuals there. If you look at the wealthy individuals, many of these people, they seem, they see them above the law. She holds an interesting example where she has an advisor to one of these wealthy people, joined with her colleague. They're invited to, come on, we're going to visit one of our communities. They go to an airplane, to an airport in Austria, and they just don't go through the pass. They don't have to show the passport. They go straight to the private jet. They fly to some other country. They don't have to show their passport. They go and do their negotiations there, and they fly back. They are, if you are sufficiently wealthy, you kind of tend to be above the law. And that's how they see them. And they also see them, in some cases, they see themselves as, why should we pay our taxes? We are not ordinaries. we are something different. And then on the other hand, if you look at multinationals, they are often pushed by their shareholders to present as huge a profit as possible to comfort their owners. You also have to, this is a kind of paraphrasing, they all try to do it to avoid as much tax as possible. You also see, for example, I'm working with a Danish millionaire who is supporting our work for a wealth tax. He says it's not sufficient to be a philanthropic, like giving some of his wealth to humanitarian causes. He's also actually supporting the call for taxing wealthy people. So you have also, what do you call humanitarian millionaires, I think the network calls themselves, where they're calling for a wealth tax, taxing themselves. And then you have multinationals, where you also see Danish larger multinationals tend to be more tax responsible. And we have since 2014 been working in a network in Denmark with the largest Danish multinationals and the largest Danish finance institutions, pension funds, on what we call tax responsibility, and establish, rules, and not rules, but principles for how you could act responsible as a corporate or as an investor. And you see increasingly number, particularly of Danish, Nordic, European companies taking on tax responsibility principle and start acting more responsible and transparent. While, and I'm sorry to call them out, particularly American companies tend to be more tax aggressive. But I mean, there are differences, and some companies very aggressive in their tax planning, and other companies more responsible toward the societies on which they profit.
So, if it's not technically illegal, and maybe some people will say that, okay, they're earning their money, why shouldn't they keep it? Then what kind of problems are tax havens causing? And especially, as you mentioned, since it's an international problem and it can relate to in between states, maybe you can talk about what actual problems this is causing and what the challenges are for individual states in dealing with this.
I mean, where I started out my career in Bolivia, looking at this, I mean, the problem was that you had huge poverty. I mean, you had a 1/3 of the population living in poverty, while a little local elite, Bolivian elite, profited extremely from the huge natural resources, jointly with multinational companies exploiting these resources. So that is, I mean, the cost of that tax avoidance or evasion was, I mean, lack of investments in education, lack of investments in infrastructure. I mean, people dying due to ordinary health issues because they couldn't get treated at a public hospital. I mean, it's fatal in developing countries. It's fatal to poor people that the global elite of the most wealthy companies, the most wealthy individuals, that they can avoid pay their contribution to the common good. I mean, to what is, I mean, just human rights. I mean, we see tax avoidance as a human rights issue. If we allow the most wealthy people and corporates on the planet not to contribute their share, we actually cannot fulfill the human rights of ordinary people. It's the 1% escaping the societies on which they built their profits. And this is important. This is why it's fair that they pay their fair share. It's because, I mean, they are not profiting, they're not making their wealth and their profits out of nothing. They're building on the shoulders of the society of which they are part. And to come back to this Danish millionaire I worked with, Jaffa Shachi, it's an interesting story. That's why I want to tell it to you. He came to Denmark as 7 years old with his 4 siblings and his parents. His parents got divorced. His mother was working as a cleaning assistant in Denmark. I mean, he entered the public school, he entered the high school, he entered the university, all free, paid by the Danish welfare state. He became an engineer and worked in one of the larger entrepreneurial businesses in Denmark. He started his own business 20 years back in construction, and he gained a fortune. But his story is saying, I mean, I earned my wealth not as because I'm very super much better than anyone else. He has been an entrepreneurial guy, but I mean, he acknowledged that he has built his wealth on the shoulders of the welfare state, which provided him with his education and with the entire structure that allowed him to gain his profits. And that's why he calls for that he and his alikes should pay back to the society on the shoulders they're building their fortunes.
So why do you think then that Scandinavian millionaires are maybe more inclined to pay their fair share than, for example, Americans?
No, I think it's crucial to talk about in tax also about the social contract. And the social contract in Denmark and in the Scandinavian countries is much stronger than in most other countries, due to that we pay a relatively high percentage of what we earn into taxes, but we also see the benefits. I mean, we see that we have great and safe societies with free education, free health, and happiness. I mean, happiness coming from being safe. I mean, I remember. I mean, when I lived in Bolivia, what happens in Bolivia is when we talk about tax with people in Bolivia, say, why should I pay to these corrupt bastards running our government? That was before the revolution in 2005. And also the huge inequality that you see in other countries outside Scandinavia, it's still increasing in Denmark and in Scandinavia, but I mean, we still have a relatively equal system. When I lived in Bolivia, I came into my house and I should have done some maintenance of the electricity system and called an electrician. And he said, "Oh, we have to change this switch. I have to go and buy a new switch." I gave him 200 Bolivianos. Did he come back? No, he did not. I mean, and my friends, my Bolivian friends, they told me, "You jerk! You gave him the money. What do you expect? Should he come back to you? What is his incentive to come back to you when you have given him the money?"
Right.
In Denmark, when I have a problem in my apartment, I mean, I call an electrician, I put the key under the doormat, he enters my apartment, he leaves my television and other stuff of value in my apartment when he repairs the thing he has to repair. He leaves a bill to me, expecting me to pay the bill, and I pay the bill. I mean, this kind of trust building on a relatively equal society is extremely efficient, and that is a problem with tax evasion in many countries, that it creates inequality, which undermines the social contract and undermines trust in each other, and therefore, I mean, also undermines happiness and well-functioning societies.
That's an interesting perspective. And I was actually thinking about this when I was reading about this, because I mean, I guess a lot of work has to be done to go after those people who are avoiding to pay taxes. But I was also maybe asking myself if it's just easier to, or it's not an easy task, but maybe it's a better way to try and build a society where, for example, trust is valued, instead of trying continuously to punish the people who are doing wrong. Right? It sounds like you're saying something like this, or I don't know if you would agree to that.
No, I think building trust, but trust comes out of building a society where everybody holds more or less the same opportunities and can see prospects to fulfill their ambitions. And ambition sounds very ambitious, but it's also the ambition of a young woman to feed her family and see a potential for getting a job at some stage. And if you don't see that potential, then you start acting asocial. I mean, then you, in many cases in development countries, you'll start migrate to pursue your chances other places in the near larger city or to another country. But also, I mean, you will enter into criminal activities if you don't see any legal means how to feed your families. So building an equal society where everyone holds opportunities is key, and this is financed by taxes. I mean, sometimes when I work in a development organization and talk a lot about development aid, I mean the key instrument to finance health and education, also in developing countries, that is through the tax bill. That is to enable countries to mobilize revenues to finance public services like education, health, and social security systems. And that's why it's key to, on the one hand, I mean, support these systems through our development aid, but more important, to stop the bleeding out of the countries. I mean, many of these developing countries, they in total, developing countries lose more from tax evasion that they get than they get from development aid. So I mean, stop the bleeding out of the countries is key to help these countries to finance a decent development.
Okay, so I guess we can agree that tax havens are something that we should do something about.
Definitely.
But what are you, because you are the policy director in Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, and you worked with this for a long time. What are you doing, and what can you do to start this work of breaking down these tax havens?
I mean, at the start, I mean, I can't do anything on my own. I mean, what is important is that in the first hand, what we do in the countries where we work as Action Aid, and we work with local partners and youth groups, where we, for an example, at the local level, we hold governments to account for the revenue in the municipality that they get from taxes, and call for transparency in their spending, and call for social investments from these resources. Right now, we are, for an example, supporting in Zimbabwe to have less tax on hygiene, hygienical kits for women. And that's a kind of having a more fair tax system for women, when we look very much at how taxes can be progressive. And that means that the the more you earn, the more you pay, and how they can spend the revenues more progressively to support particularly women and youth and poor people. But I mean, in other countries, in Zambia, we've been working with local organizations to have a copper mine there, owned by one of the largest multinationals in the natural resource industry, Glencore. How we can make sure that it start paying taxes in Zambia to finance, exactly these public services. So looking at these larger multinationals operating in the developing countries is what we do with the local partners to address the specific loopholes that these companies, these mines, they use to avoid paying taxes, but also uses that as examples at the international level to call for changes in the international tax systems. And that is, for an example, going to Europe, where we right now work at the European level to where as we speak, discussions in the European community between the Commission, the Parliament, and the European Council about a new directive, which is suggested by civil society organizations, including Action Aid Denmark, on how multinational companies of a certain size should present public country-by-country reporting. And that is that a mining company like Glencore operating in Zambia, they should report their profits, their activities, their sales in all the countries where they have presence, including in Zambia, in Switzerland, and in Cayman Islands and other places. So we can see how they manipulate their accounts and move the profits to avoid paying taxes in Zambia and move the profits to Switzerland, where they pay a very low corporate tax rate. So having these kind of system change, I would call it, on getting a directive of the EU level, which will be implemented at the European and in the longer term in the global level, to call for more transparency into corporate accounts. That is a crucial part of what we do. We're also calling out jointly now with some odd new allies for an increased corporate tax rate. The corporate tax rate has, over the last 40 years at the global scale, been halved from approximately 50% on average to down to 20-25%. And right now we are calling for increased corporate tax rate. And fascinatingly, the Conservative government of the United Kingdom has just adopted a legislation to increase the tax rate from 19 to 25%. That is, a revolution taking place. And the Biden administration in the US, they're suggesting to increase their tax rate from 21 to 28%. And are also calling for an international minimum corporate tax rate. And this is all elements that we in the tax justice movement over the last 20 years have been calling for, to, instead of continuously decreasing the corporate tax rate and the personal income tax rate in a race to the bottom, saying we have to compete with other countries, so we always have to lower the tax rates, with the only beneficiaries being rich people and larger corporations. Now we see a reverse of this trend, and this is potentially a paradigm shift at the global economic level, which is, we have seen since 1980 with Thatcher and Reagan. We saw the introduction of a neoliberal economic thinking, where you should roll back the state, free the market, have global free trade systems. Now we see post-COVID-19 crisis, we see potentially a paradigm shift with a new role for the government, with where the governments have been supporting not only workplaces and ordinary people through the crisis, but increasingly also companies have been investing hugely in supporting supporting the economy. And we see a new role for the state, for the government in the economy, and a new balance between the state and the market, which is holds to me great perspectives for the future.
Okay, exciting. You sound very, very optimistic.
Right now, there's reason to be optimistic. I mean, we see for the first time in 40 years, we see a serious challenge to the neoliberal thinking. We see a new approach to what I call market fundamentalism. I mean, that the market should rule everything, towards an increased democratic control of the economy as well, and a stronger role for democratic regulation of the economy. This is potentially a very big shift we're seeing, hopefully.
Mm. But am I correct in hearing that this is primarily an initiative from the state and from international sort of stately organizations?
I mean, it's crucial to understand that to address tax havens and tax avoidance as a systemic problem, we need cooperation between countries. In many countries, in Denmark and globally, and in the European Union, there's among countries a perception that we should take back control, the Britons would say, on our tax systems. But the only way to take back control on tax is to cooperate with other countries. It's an illusion to think that you can control your own tax system in a global economy where wealthy people and multinationals operate at a global scale. You cannot control anything as an isolated country. That's what we have been seeing over the recent years with the increasing tax dodging by wealthy people and multinationals exploiting this global system. So we have to cooperate between countries, and that's potentially what we see right now. So on the one hand, we see very important cooperation taking place at the European level. We see at the OECD level, OECD is a rich countries club, I call it. They have been coordinating a lot of initiatives to curb tax evasion and avoidance. However, with the exclusion of developing countries from the decision-making bodies. So developing countries' interests are not taken into account. And we see a UN system which potentially could be strengthened which is more inclusive and also hold the voices of developing countries. But the measures that are now taken by the UK government, by the US administration, by the European Union are, and I'm proud of this, measures, all of them suggested by the tax justice movement. The idea about this country-by-country reporting, transparency into multinational companies' accounts was suggested by tax justice activists back in 2003. The idea of strengthening wealth taxation is when tax justice movement suggestions. The idea of increasing corporate tax, that's what we have been calling for in the tax justice movement. So to a certain extent, we have a potentially a very successful movement where we have been struggling for this for 20 years, and now we start seeing some of the results. And this is maybe also a point that change takes time. We have a lot of activists across the world and movements who have been calling for this for the last 20 years, and now we start. Now we have a chance using this crisis, the COVID crisis, the pandemic, to push through systemic changes.
That's amazing. I'm very glad to hear that. You mentioned the COVID crisis. How has that affected the situation?
Let me make an analogy to back in the 70s, where we have a huge economic or the oil crisis, and in 1980s, it led to the introduction of the neoliberal model. That was a global economic crisis, which some people and think tanks and thinkers deliberately used to change economic thinking towards a neoliberal market fundamentalism model. The COVID crisis provides the same opportunities to us as social justice and tax justice fighters to use this crisis to push through potentially huge changes in economic thinking. And there are two elements in this. On the one hand, the COVID crisis, which is global and global by nature, you have seen at a difference from the financial crisis in 2008, 2010, where you said we have to shrink the public sector, we have to introduce austerity policies, we have to reduce spending. in this crisis, we've been saying, no, let's take on lending at the government level and invest in supporting companies, supporting workers, supporting ordinary people, holding a very big and strong hand under the economy. And this is a game changer. To a certain extent, there is a problem is that the governments are building up huge debts right now, and still increasingly, we're talking about an economic crisis. This is only a crisis in the bottom of the societies to ordinary people and to unemployed people who are affected by the crisis. If you look at the wealthy, 1%, 10%, you have seen in Denmark, for example, the property market exploding with a 10% increase in prices, and that is particularly to the 10% wealthiest people. You have seen the stock market explode in Denmark. You have never seen the stock market as strong as it is right now, again to the benefit of the 10% richest in Denmark. And this is a global tendency that you see that rich people are not affected by this crisis. They are actually gaining from the crisis, while ordinary people are affected on this crisis. So this is the challenge. This is where tax justice come into place, because when we have to finance these measures that we're putting in place now to curb the crisis, it's about increasing the revenues to the government through tax policies. And that's why the UK and the US are introducing these increases in the corporate tax rates these days as we speak. Then I also have to say the climate crisis has kind of been overshadowed by the COVID crisis. The climate crisis hasn't escaped. It's just been, overshadowed. Yeah. And what I also believe is there's an increased understanding that we have to invest in a green and just transition. And to do that, we cannot leave that to the market forces. We have seen the market and the market fundamentalism over the last 40 years creating this climate crisis through a totally unsustainable consumption and production patterns. Now, with the climate crisis, we have to change these patterns, and we have to invest heavily with a democratically regulated investments to ensure that it is green investments. And we cannot leave that to the market alone. So there's the green economy, the need for a green transition is also changing the perception of what the roles are for the governments and the private sector in a green transition. That's another very important tendency that we see these days.
Do you think it's likely, because it's one thing that the governments want to raise the taxes, but do you think it's likely that the corporations will pay taxes, or will they always just find new ways of doing this and that to avoid paying those taxes, and so it's irrelevant if it's low or high?
They have the corporations, multinationals, and their advisors have been and are still extremely innovative in how to avoid paying taxes. I normally say that the transaction cost to avoid taxes has increased. It's increasingly more complicated, and you have to have an increasingly higher paid advisor. But we haven't closed the loopholes. And particularly if you look at corporate taxation, the system for how we tax multinational companies was invented 100 years ago. And it's when we're trying to solve the problems within that system, it's like taking a Ford A produced in 1930 and putting it into a highway today and try to fix it and increase its speed. It's never going to work. We have to rethink the way that we tax corporations. And the problem is that we treat multinationals as separate. A multinational consisting of hundreds of companies, subsidiaries across many countries. We treat them as individual companies when we try to tax them. Instead of, and this is particularly pertinent for the tech industry, companies like Apple, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. where their presence in countries is artificial. It's a digital presence they have. So it's increasingly hard to tax them. And due to, particularly this problem of taxing the tech industry, has sparked an understanding of the need to reform the tax system towards a system where you treat multinationals as global entities and say, Apple, they hold a profits of $50 billion a year. And you can say, how much of that profit is generated at Bermuda, where they book most of their profit? It's nil. It's nothing. So you can through a formula looking at where do they have their sales, where do they have their assets, where do they have their employment. Through a formula based on those three components, you can say 20% of the profit of Apple should be booked in the United States and they should be taxed there. And 1% should be booked in Denmark and 3% in the UK and so forth. But treating corporations as global entities and taking their profits and distributing it to countries for taxations in each of the countries where they generate a value, that would be a much more fair system. And I believe not in the first 5 years, not in the next 10 years, but within 15, 20 years from now, I believe that we'll see a change towards another way of taxing multinationals. But it could also be earlier. Sometimes you see changes coming in big jumps.
Well, I hope you're right, Lars. Is there anything else you would like to add before we move to close this podcast episode?
And just saying that, to ordinary people in Denmark or in Africa or in Asia, this is a key issue. We have to engage in this. This is the key system through where the global elite of wealthy people and corporations, they escape their responsibilities for the societies that they are part of, and we have to end this. It's a key issue, and we are taking great steps in that direction, but there's a long way to go, and we should keep up that fight.
Well, thank you for doing your part at least, Lars, and thank you so much for coming here. It's been very educational.
Thanks, a pleasure.
If this interview has piqued your curiosity, we've got a lot going on in Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke, Aarhus. Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke is a Danish NGO that works for a more just and sustainable world, collaborating with global partners worldwide as a part of ActionAid Alliance. Here in Aarhus, we have over 100 volunteers working together to run a not-for-profit cafe and campaign and educate in areas ranging from feminism and climate justice to anti-discrimination and economic inequality to queer issues and refugee rights. You can come down to Café Mellemfolk every day but Sunday for amazing food, drinks and events in a cozy cafe run by our lovely volunteers. You can also get involved with our events, activities and campaigns, and even running the cafe as a volunteer yourself. So go check out Instagram and Facebook to find out more about our cafe and our campaigns by looking up Café Mellemfolk or Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke Aarhus, or following the links in the episode notes. And check out Podbean, YouTube, and other podcast providers for more episodes and interviews. Details are in the episode description. Thank you everyone for listening, and until next time, goodbye.